I started to feel like that there are three distinct parts of the disability community. If you take the disability community to be everybody with any kind of physical or mental disability, you could divide it up in a lot of different ways. But one way that I think of it
Mm-hmm.
often and come back to is you've got disability activism, where you're dealing with legislation and goals of policy and practice, whether on a governmental level or even down at the community and workplace level. It's still kind of active, and you're trying to change laws, policy, and practices. And then you've got what I would call disability culture. And this is the people who are kind of doing, I think, what you're doing, which is let's talk about what the experience of disability is. And it can include some of the medical stuff, but also the social. How do we, what's our relationship with our disabilities? How do we feel others treat us? And it includes disability expressions of art, people who do poetry, people who do music, people who do visual art, people who do podcasts, write books, do articles.
Mm-hmm.
That's disability culture. And there's a lot of crossover with activism, but it's not quite the same. There are definitely people out there who, at first blush, you would say, well, they're activists, but they don't actually try to follow legislation that much or policy change much. What they're really
Yeah.
talking about is how society views disability and how they view disability. And then there's a third group that I think of as like everybody else. That's people who have disabilities, aren't really into activism, don't think about disability that much in and of itself, and are just like trying to live with disabilities.
Yeah.
And the thing that I always want to know is, for number one, does that even make sense to think of it in those three different groups? And then how many people are in those groups? Because, again, that's getting back to the question of whether people who write about disability or whatever, whether we can speak for the disability community, well, are we 5% of the disability community or 30% or 50%,
Mm-hmm.
right? Are all the people that write all the articles and do all the legislative work and do the books and the podcasts and discussions, do all of us amount to a tiny, tiny, tiny number of all the disabled people in America or in the world? Or do we actually add up to a lot if we put it all together? I just don't know. And that's one of the things I'm always really curious about.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I would consider my mom part of that third group. Like, she's legally blind, but I recently introduced her into some Facebook groups that involve RP, and she's kind of gotten into that. But she just worked and lived her life, and and I have a hunch, and I'm curious to know what your hunch is. I have a feeling that there's more people in that third group than the other two groups.
That's my hunch for sure.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that I think that there's a lot of those folks who do activism sometimes, right?
Yes.
Who, if let's say somebody who's blind or legally blind, that if push comes to shove, and they are clearly denied a job, for instance, in a really unfair way based on their disability, they might get mad about it, and they might do something about it or try to do something about it.
Sure. Yeah.
If a piece of
if it directly impacts them, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and not even that sounds selfish, and sometimes it starts that way, and they might even expand it a little bit and say, you know what, I've had a couple of experiences, and I noticed this piece of legislation out there that would say require alternative format government materials, or that my college would do a better job of, accommodating people with visual impairments or something, and they would take that up as an issue, who are sort of somewhere between. So there's people on all those different sides, and there are people who will write about their personal experiences on disability or share them with local news and stuff like that, who could be viewed as part of disability culture. So, again, it's all blurry, but
Yes.
which is fine.
I think what's fascinating about that is, breaking it down to your three groups is, you mentioned it, is it just 5% that are really into the broadcasting of acceptance of, the podcast or, the activist. And then those people are such a small percent, possibly might be such a small percentage of the community, yet those people feel as if they're talking for the entire community. And then those people in that third group we're talking about who just are living with their disability, maybe they don't want those people to even talk for them. You know what I mean?
And I think that's a legitimate question, and to be humble, we have to keep all that in mind. At the same time, even if it is only 5% or less, it's the 5% that got the ADA passed, that got almost everything that is there to accommodate in society disability has come from that little sliver. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, even if that's true,
I know what you mean.
Then we still have to think about the fact that maybe even that's okay. And again, those of us who are part of that, if we are, should maybe be humble and constantly remember that we don't speak for everybody. And most of the activists that I know do not claim to do that. It's more of something that's lobbed at them from people who have some other reason to not like what they're doing. But it's still something to be aware of. But again, even if it is just a tiny group, and maybe it's not that unusual that usually it's a relatively small number of people who do make the most change that benefits the others. And maybe that's okay.
That's a great point.
And maybe that's okay to an extent. We'd always like to have more allies and more people on board, but maybe that's just the way things happen. I don't know. Still learning all this stuff.